Hey everyone, this is Duncan Field from the Devils in the Details podcast. I'm really excited to bring you this special episode we're recording because I think it's going to be a very exciting one for most of you. As you know, the Devils have the second overall selection at the upcoming 2022 NHL entry draft, and there's quite a bit of debate about it. We think that Shane Wright is likely to go number one to Montreal, which leaves the Devils with a really interesting choice of players at number two. There is the Slovak winger Juraj Slafkovsky, 6'4" power forward. We have Logan Cooley, the top American prospect from the U.S. National Team Development Program, who plays at center. There's also an outside chance of a defenseman. We have Simon Nemec and David Jiricek, both of who play fairly different games. So with the draft only a week and a half away, I thought it'd be great to get an inside opinion on some of these players, who they are, and why Devils fans should be excited. So I'm really excited to bring forward this interview with Brad Allen from hockeyprospect.com. Brad is the person I trust the most when it comes to the drafts. He has been doing this for a long time. He puts in the hours. He has a ton of viewings on not even just dozens of prospects for each year's drafts, like 100 to 200 players. He knows his stuff. He is, a very critical thinker when it comes to even the fine details of a player's game. He's also the person that trained me when I helped out with the Hockey Prospect Black Book during last year's draft. And so, I sat down with Brad for about 45 minutes to talk about Slafkovsky mostly, but as he compares to Shane Wright and Logan Cooley, and why the Devils fan base should be really excited about what they'll find at the top of the draft this year. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you're interested in learning more, I highly, highly suggest checking out the Black Book. It's available now at hockeyprospect.com. It is the most in-depth resource I've ever seen for the NHL draft. If you're a draft fanatic like me, it has very detailed breakdowns of each player's games. It has dozens of game reports, and perhaps most enticingly, it has really interesting comments from both Hockey Prospect staff, but also anonymous NHL scouts and executives for each player. And by combining all those things, you get this really interesting, unique picture of who a player is, what their skills and strengths are, where some of their weaknesses are, but also what actual people around the industry think about that player. And you'll be surprised sometimes at the difference between what might be the public perception of a prospect in the lead up to the draft and what some people behind the scenes really think. So I highly recommend it. If you're a more casual fan, it is a fantastic resource to look back on after your team has selected players at the draft, just to get the inside scoop and get a bit of a fuller picture of who just joined your team's prospect pool. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Definitely check out hockeyprospect.com and the Black Book, and we'll talk to you soon. I'm curious, kind of off the top, if you could just talk about Slafkovsky a little bit, because the general thinking out there in the public is that Wright is still likely to go number one, which leaves the Devils with some interesting choices at number two in the draft. And the recently released Black Book has Slafkovsky at number one. Just curious if you could speak a bit as to why the team feels that way, and maybe some of your own thoughts about the player.
Juraj Slafkovsky is a pretty unique prospect that has below average production than what you're looking for in a top end prospect in his league. Right. So in Liga, it's a below the SHL, below the KHL, below the AHL in terms of quality. So we put it in the same bracket as say the NLA. So it's a secondary Euro Pro league that's decent, and it does simulate the North American game at a high rate, which does help when it comes to projecting prospects. The issue with Slafkovsky is that, you're usually typically looking at Capo Caco production for a top 2-3 player, which is a roughly point per game. Anton Lundell, who came underneath that, but you get the idea. Slafkovsky finished, I believe, with 10 points. So it really puts things in perspective, saying, well, what's going on here? Why would people think that this is an elite blue chip prospect with such a lack of production? But production always needs context. So within the context of Slafkovsky, what you're looking at is that he was uncomfortable in his environment. And sometimes it just happens. It can be a result of coaching. I'm not saying that it is. I don't know the situation there well enough to say anything outside of speculation. I'm just giving you more of a general overview as to some of the issues that might be occurring, which is coaching, systems, just the teammates and the lines and what is expected of him in each game, because you have to realize that his ice time wasn't that high when it came to playing for TPS. He was used in more of a complementary role at times.
Mhm.
So, the issues with Slafkovsky was that the brilliant creativity and dynamic play that he presents in his game internationally was not present in TPS. And so as scouts, what we have to do is we have to weight how much we decide to put on his league play relative to his international performances. What's really interesting about Slafkovsky is just how contrasting those performances truly are. So if you took his Hlinka performance at the start of the year, and then if you took his Olympic performance, and then took his World Championship performance, you could make an argument that those three international performances were three of the best we've ever seen, ever. Right? Talking about MVP of his team at the Olympic level, the World Championships. I know that his production was mostly against average to below average teams at that event, but he was very good against teams like Canada, for instance, regardless of the fact he didn't produce. I know some people will say, well, at the Olympics, wasn't a ton of NHL talent. That's true, but it was still top end European talent. The SHL, for instance, when he's going up against Sweden, you're still in with a decent team. And so when you look at that, and then you look again at his Hlinka performance, which was dominant against the 2022 class here, it starts showing, we think, the more representative version of the player. And the more representative version is truly one of the most unique players I've ever scouted. One of the biggest differences, let's do a contrast with them, say Kakko, for instance, another power forward, developed in Liga, produced better in Slafkovsky. There are major differences between their games. Kakko is a more dangerous option on the power play because of his one-timer. He's a better overall, more consistent shooter than Slafkovsky. Despite, I know for some of you listening to this, if you saw Slafkovsky score internationally, you would say, well, heck on, his shot is pretty good too. Like, hold on, it's pretty good. But to be honest, if you took his entire shot sample between TPS and league, TPS and international play, which I did, you'd see a much more inconsistent shooter. So those would be the biggest contrasting points that Kakko has an advantage in. It's the goal scoring upside. However, if you look at Slafkovsky basically everywhere else, I think he has an advantage over Kakko. He's a better playmaker. He's one of the most brilliant technical puck handlers relative to his size that I've ever seen. He's also an incredibly creative handler. So, for instance, in the Black Book, one of the descriptions I break down is that he seems to have the same level of creativity that you see in smaller forwards like Niels Hoglander. He's an incredibly inventive puck handler, is very good at trap deking, meaning that he's able to manipulate the triangle of defensemen and then counteract their pivoting base and time his handling to the pivoting of the defense to keep them off balance. He knows how to force pucks in the skates of defensemen and put them in uncomfortable positions where they have to try to readjust on the fly. And then when you factor in his frame, the 6'4", 220, it means he's incredibly difficult to handle, not just in straight lines, not just linearly, but when it comes to a 360-degree plane of motion. We're talking about horizontal or on an angle attack, lateral cutting. He's incredibly explosive, incredibly dangerous. The other factor is that he's an incredibly inventive player when it comes to how he operates around the net area down low. So, for instance, if you compare him to, say, Vitaly Kravtsov, Kravtsov is one of the best puck handlers around the boards and net area that you'll see. I know it hasn't translated at the NHL level yet, but believe me when I say in the KHL, we've seen a ton of examples, and internationally, a ton of examples where he can just make defensemen look really foolish as a result of knowing how to time using the net to pass the puck back to himself around defensemen and pull and create exit routes for himself, create fake contact points, trapdoor scenarios where he creates an exit route while bypassing the defense who are trying to cover him. And with Slafkovsky, he's shown that he wants to be he wants to almost transcend what it means to be able to handle at that size. And we know that he is studying the game because I don't know if you remember this, Duncan, but Elias Pettersson's preseason deke that broke Strom's ankles, Ryan Strom's ankles. So
Yeah.
Slafkovsky attempted the exact same deke. He mistimed it slightly, but he attempted it, and it was identical in the position on the ice too. And you can tell that okay, he studied that, and then he tried to apply it. Well, he also was studying other players handling, like Hoglander, like Kravtsov's, and you can see him applying it in unique applications, like using the net, but not instead of using the back of the net down below the goal line, he'll bank a pass back to himself off the side of the net, and then try to stick lift the opposing player simultaneously while driving inside. These are subtle, small, but extremely important skill differentiators within Slafkovsky that are not present in almost any other power forward that we've ever seen.
I feel like the amount of times he's described as unique is really intriguing, and it makes the next question even more important. I know Mark Edwards in the Black Book writes about the difference in typical value between centers and wingers, and how that tends to be a pretty important kind of factor in rankings. And despite that, still putting Slafkovsky about at one above Shane Wright, who's I think maybe publicly the consensus or close to the consensus. And I thought your quote in the Black Book was really interesting as it related to this. You could make the claim that Slafkovsky couldn't have performed better in his peak performances and Wright couldn't have performed worse in his. Is that really what it comes down to for you, given that centers are typically valued a bit higher than wingers, that Slafkovsky excelled when it mattered most and Wright seemed to struggle a bit more with that? Is that what puts the winger above the center for you?
It's definitely a part of it. So peak performances definitely matter in a draft season, but you don't want to weight them too heavily. My comment was more to explain that Shane Wright really just didn't perform up to the expectations we expected, even when his numbers in a game suggested he did perform. So even though he had finished with 3 or 4 points in a game, they were quiet. There wasn't and what I mean by quiet is that when you're talking about possession driving metrics, Slafkovsky was miles ahead of him. So there would be games where Slafkovsky would dominate possession against way better competition than Shane Wright faced in the OHL for the majority of the season, and yet he didn't produce. Where Shane Wright wouldn't dominate possession, wouldn't look the part of a true number 1 overall pick, yet put up 3 or 4 points because the OHL this year, which is something we should be discussing here too. I don't think it's getting enough discussion, which is that the OHL this season was honestly the worst I've ever seen it in the last decade. This was the worst. So why I'm saying that is because this was a draft season where if you ask me going in what Shane Wright should have finished with, I think it should have been closer to 120 points and 50 goals. So look at Marco Rossi, Quentin Byfield's production, more along those lines with more goals because Shane Wright's an elite shooter in terms of at least technical mechanics, right? So he didn't do that. And so neither one really had great production, to be honest. I know 90 points is nothing to sneeze at. It's not bad by any stretch. And, roughly compared to 10 points in 40 Liga games, or it's even worse than that when you factor in his playoffs. But again, limited ice time. But still, neither one are high-end producers. Even when you factor in Logan Cooley, who haven't gotten to yet, his production was good, but it was not magnificent. That's one of the drawbacks of this draft in terms of the top 8 as a whole. This class is weaker in the top 8 to 10 picks, but it's an incredibly wonky draft in the sense that you would think as a byproduct of the top 8 to 10 being weaker, it would have a trickle down effect and this draft would just be weak in general. Yet I find myself thinking that this draft is one of the deepest of the last decade. I know for some of you listening, you'd be like, I've heard the opposite. I've heard this is kind of a bad class.
Right.
The truth is that listen, I don't know. Okay, we'll find out in 5 years. It's the actual answer to this. But I am somebody who does watch over 200, 250 prospects a year. And when I mean I watch them, I don't just watch one or two games of some of these kids. When we're talking about top 90 to a top 120 players in the draft, like at least I watch them 10 games on average. And if you're talking about top 60, I've seen 20 games on average, right? So can I be right here? Listen, I'm a scout. My life is based around being wrong all the time and being comfortable with that. Okay. But I really think from 11 to 50 specifically in this class, I can't remember a class I like more. So there is some value. But sorry, going back to the topic of Slafkovsky versus Wright, it's you cannot ask for two players that are more different, right? So in Slafkovsky, you have a 200-foot, 6'4", 220-pound, explosive, high energy, high paced, possession driving winger. Okay. In Shane Wright, you have a calculated, technical savant who can play a 200-foot game, but does it very differently than Slafkovsky. Shane Wright is a brilliant anticipator of the play. He's very good at calculating and being precise within his calculations to get results. So that has value, a tremendous amount of value, because it screams efficiency. However, one of the biggest issues, this is not just me. If you had 10 NHL scouts sitting down next to me here, 9 of them would probably agree with me on this following statement, which is that we wanted more out of Shane Wright in terms of his pacing. Shane Wright didn't bring a lot of conditioning with him this season, and it's something we know that he's evaluated because he has come out and said, I need to get faster and I need to get better in better shape, because there would be times where he would be overly reliant on his anticipation of the play, or overly reliant on trying to be too technical when it was time to simply try to overwhelm another player. You can be technical, but you can be technical to a fault, where you're relying more on your stick when you should rely on maintaining or obtaining inside body positioning before you go after the puck in the corners, as an example. If you're on the forecheck, make sure that you at least keep the pace necessary to generate the pressure on opposing defensemen, so their retrieval rates get broken, or that their first exit has a reduced chance of being able to work through the neutral zone. Shane has not shown the ability to do that at the level that suggests what a lot of people have described him as, which is a Patrice Bergeron. That said, can he get there? Right. That's the question. Is what we've seen from Shane Wright actually Shane Wright? And to answer that question, I went back to his first rookie OHL season in Kingston, where we thought he was a lot better. And he did play with more energy. And I felt like his skating was actually slightly better when he was younger. And that does happen occasionally if a player puts on the wrong kind of weight. Shane Wright came in again this year a little worse for wear in terms of conditioning. It did affect his performance. So these are the factors that when you're evaluating, okay, so if Slafkovsky still has room to fill out, but he's also a bigger, much more powerful athlete who's already more comfortable playing at a higher pace. And then so you're relying on more physical variables when it comes down to Shane Wright long term than you are Slafkovsky. And then when it comes to possession driving, it's okay for you to take the winger as long as he is somebody who can dictate in the offensive zone and maintain possession, which is what he does, where Shane Wright doesn't do that. That is not embedded in Shane's game. Shane is all about manipulating the first layer and then using his vision to find options, or using his tremendous shot quality. One thing that we talk about in the Black Book that we want to describe within Shane's game to give you, the readers and listeners to the show, a better idea of where Shane Wright is that he's relying too much on it, though. So I bring up the shot quality, meaning just how much velocity is showcased in his wrist shot. Or that Shane has one of the top 3 kinetic chains in this draft, to be able to manipulate his joints and exploding, rotating through his shot from his knees to his hips to his shoulders. His ability to rotate through his shot is incredible, but he was overly reliant on it, which is one of the reasons his goal scoring rates went down. So one thing I did is I tracked over 260 even strength shots that Shane Wright took, and 17 of them were a result of him willing to drive to the interior portion of the rink, shoulder to shoulder, and try to get into a better shooting area. Right. So that this is one of several factors in determining why did his goal scoring rates go down. The others is that he plays a much more streamlined game where he doesn't look to attack or manipulate one-on-one nearly as often as Slafkovsky does. He's more passive. There's passivity in Wright. There's a lack of vinegar in Shane Wright's blood. There's almost a lack of competitiveness that's displayed when he's out on the ice. You don't want that in a first overall pick. You're looking for a dictator, right? Slafkovsky has shown the willingness to dictate. All this said, I still think Shane Wright will end up being the better point producer. The question is, will it matter if Slafkovsky is that much more dominant defensively and more dominant being able to drive possession?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because for fans who don't have access to game tape of draft eligibles, like who don't have an Instat account, for example, the big question mark around Slafkovsky is that production piece. Because for fans who don't have that kind of window into the game to game process that each prospect displays, production is the best thing that we have to form an opinion about, the value of that player, where they should be taken, or how we should feel about our favorite team selecting them. And I think specifically for New Jersey fans, where there's been a perception that the team has picked certain prospects because of things like size or being kind of a prototypical power forward, overlooking other players whose production outshines the player that was ultimately selected. That there's almost like a Pavlovian response to seeing someone described as a power forward that doesn't have that league production, where fans start to put their defenses up and go, oh gosh, it's happening again. Can you talk a bit about, just that difference in perspective? Because the way you're describing Slafkovsky, despite his league production, is speaking to tools and things that you're seeing, like the real like minutia that you see as the projectable pieces, as opposed to the points, which I think maybe more casual fans tend to see as the projectable pieces.
As we previously stated, points need context, right? You have to remember that environmental conditions are critical in determining the future success of a player. And sometimes a lack of confidence can really suppress the actual production that would theoretically be there if the player wasn't in that state. For instance, I'll give you listeners a pretty good indicator that you would know close. Nico Hischier. I find Nico Hischier to be a very different player when he's lacking confidence. There seems to be a component to Nico where when he doesn't feel his game offensively, it's almost like he's too reliant on trying to play just his 200-foot game and trying to take control of the middle, where you almost want him to just break out of that and just say, go for it. And same could be said with Elias Pettersson. Look at Elias Pettersson in his first 25 games for Vancouver this season. Then look where he was at the end of the season. You're talking about a completely different player. And that's my point. Juraj Slafkovsky has been a completely different player for TPS than he has internationally. That's the argument. The argument is we think Juraj Slafkovsky, the real player, the real version of him, is the one that dominated the Olympics and was fantastic at the World Championship level when Shane Wright was struggling in the playoffs. Right? Now, there is a way to counteract some of this, though. Make no mistake, too, I don't want listeners to think that this is like, I take Slafkovsky 10 times out of 10 and it's not a debate. It is a debate. The real problem with evaluating Shane this season was that COVID created the pause and there was a massive delay in development. The other component, which I think is really relevant, some scouts would disagree with me on this, but I think it's really relevant, which is that if you look at projected number ones or top end talent in recent draft classes, a lot of them have fallen flat in their draft season. I think it's a byproduct of the fact that social media has now exploded when it comes to draft type, and it's put these extremely young developing minds in a position where they're reading a lot about themselves, and I think it's really putting them in a pressure situation that's breaking them. Atu Ratu came out publicly after his draft season and said, yeah, it was really bad. It did not help him at all to have that much hype being generated going into his draft year, because you start looking at things you normally wouldn't look at as a player. You're starting to try to count your goals, right? You're starting to count count things that you're not supposed to be counting as a player. You're not supposed to count your goals. You're supposed to just make sure that your shot rates are up in the high quality areas of the ice. That's it. These types of factors are going to play on a mind of a 17 or 18-year-old developing adult. Shane Wright would probably not tell you that it affected him. He probably would tell you the opposite. I'm willing to bet it did affect him. And it's affected a lot of these players. I think it affected Brad Lambert. I think it affected basically any player that came into the season with a tremendous amount of hype. It's look at Alexei Lafreniere in his first season, right? It was difficult for him to get going. I think as an industry, at least at the NHL level, I think we have to be a bit careful when it comes to how much we weigh the actual draft season relative to their -1 now, if they are an elite talent, just because of the pressure. So with that said, like when you weight that with Shane and you weight the fact that he missed a year, if you take that in consideration, you look at really what he's capable of doing when he seems to be playing up to his standards. Well, then there's absolutely an argument to be made that you should take him above Juraj Slafkovsky. I mean, Juraj Slafkovsky is not going to be this goal scorer that Shane Wright's going to be in the NHL. Shane Wright is a technical master at shooting. Juraj Slafkovsky in some areas struggles. So there are definitely components, as you said, the winger to center, the goal scoring rates. I think 200-foot game. They do it differently. I actually think Slafkovsky will be the more dominant 200-foot player. Think Valeri Nichushkin. That's kind of what you're looking at in terms of being able to shut down players defensively and drive possession through the neutral zone too. That's another thing is neutral zone entry rates actually favor Juraj Slafkovsky. And food for thought, there are some people in this industry, including myself, who might just think that Juraj Slafkovsky could be a center.
Well, that's a very spicy thing to say, Brad. That's because that feeds so much into like the whole thing about social media. I hear you, and I can't imagine that reading about yourself being picked apart for sometimes 2 or 3 years in advance. Of course, that it makes sense that has an impact, but so much of the discourse is reductive. Where right now, if you talk about Shane Wright versus Juraj Slafkovsky on Devils Twitter, it's basically two-way centerman versus big power forward, and that does so little to capture the details of each player's game that it's almost the opposite of helpful. But the thought of Slafkovsky at center really starts to twist the calculus that I think a lot of people who are more casually following this debate are using for sure.
Yeah, okay. So the center argument is there's a couple of points to be made. The first is what I just said about the Valeri Nichushkin effect defensively. When you have a 6'4", 220-pound player who plays with pace and knows how to take the body, that's a good start. He's not a dumb player. This is a pretty intelligent hockey player who can play on both sides of the puck. So when you're talking about the theoretical ability for him to support his own defenseman down low and may be able to help get the puck moving up the right direction of the ice, he can do that. He can do that. When you look at neutral zone entry rates, I actually think Slafkovsky has an advantage over Shane Wright. Slafkovsky is a better skater relative to his size than Shane. Slafkovsky is a better puck handler. Slafkovsky is more inventive. Slafkovsky's best primary attribute is his playmaking ability. He can make passes on his backhand. He can make exceptional leading passes that calculate the trajectory of his teammates that are parallel to him when going through the neutral zone. So when you're talking about the defensive side and the neutral zone, Slafkovsky's there. The reason that there's hesitation with defining him as a center is that it does take away the best attribute of his handling, which I described earlier, which is it takes away his creativity off the walls and around the net. Right. You're not going to get as much of that when he's at center. Not as much. You're also going to have to deal with the idea that he's not going to get an opportunity to play down low and just crash and bang and use his size around the net areas often. That said, the give and take is there in terms of the fact that he can stay above the puck, the fact he can control the middle. There are definitely aspects to Slafkovsky to suggest it's not out of the realm of possibility. That said, a team that drafts Slafkovsky, I don't think would be taking him because they actually think that he's going to just straight up be a center. You're looking at him as a player who's probably going to still be more comfortable on the wing, and they'll take the bonus if he can play center. Right. That's I think the way to look at Slafkovsky. But I think the most important point to make to you beautiful Devil fans out there with all your passion. I've seen a lot of it online, is that you're in a very good position. You have phenomenal center depth. Right? You have like Hischier and Hughes. I mean, there's a lot of the league wishes they had Jack Hughes and Nico Hischier. Okay. The only drawback of your center depth is that you don't have a big center. You know, every team wants to have a big center for matchup purposes. You don't have that. But if you have Slafkovsky and Sharangovich on your wings, it doesn't hurt, right? It doesn't hurt you.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And I think brings me to maybe the last name that I wanted to ask you about, which was Logan Cooley. So when talking with other Devils fans about this draft, there's kind of a blanket assumption that like, okay, Shane Wright is taken by Montreal at first, and that leaves the Devils with their pick of Slafkovsky, thought of as the winger, the power forward, Logan Cooley, and then the two defensemen, Simon Nemec and Juracek. And the debate between Cooley and Slafkovsky is interesting because so much of the discourse is weighted towards Slafkovsky's lack of production in Liga, and the fact that he's primarily, thought of as a winger. The thought is that if the Devils pick Slafkovsky, they're passing up on a more productive center in Logan Cooley. Do you have any thoughts on Cooley and maybe how the two players compare?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cooley, it's so interesting. All these three players are so different. Like you couldn't ask for more different players. They really are contrasting talents. So I'll say this up front. I would be shocked if Montreal took Cooley first. So you really are looking at Slafkovsky and Cooley here, most likely. Let's go with that. Let's go with the assumption that I think Montreal is in a bad spot, to be honest, in the fact that Kent Hughes is a new GM. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to take what was perceived to be a potential generational talent in Shane Wright. And because of the center position, right? That said, you look at Montreal. I mean, they were not hard to play against. They lacked pace, they lacked size, they lacked everything, and Slafkovsky does bring that. So it'll be very interesting on draft day either way. But with Logan Cooley, he's arguably the most dynamic talent in the draft in terms of his puck handling ability at going with his top speed. Okay, so when you're talking about north-south, peak power output, linear skating ability, in combination with his handling, his adaptive handling, it's phenomenal, right? That's the real value of Cooley. It's the transition game, the ability to break down through the first layer with the skating and handling combination, and the ability to make plays. He's a very unique player in some ways. So, for instance, from a physical perspective, he's a wide track skater, meaning he's just got a wider hip girdle. He has to. When he's skating, there's an outward flare to how he moves, and he's actually basically developed his skill set around his wide track skating. One of the things that was very interesting for me to monitor, track, assess, watch was that this player, out of any player I've monitored the last 5 years, tries the most in between the leg passes per 60 out of any player I've scouted. So that's good and bad. The good is that he is extremely confident and can be an incredibly inventive and creative playmaker and make some otherworldly passes from time to time. It's good to see the amount of skill he has pop in terms of his playmaking. And I like the fact that you have a player that's adapting his own physiology to a skill set. It tells you that he's thinking about how to get this done on the ice, right? The problem though is a lot of it's not translatable. So he's the most raw of the three, is what I'm trying to get at. When you're talking about who's the most ready to play tomorrow, it's not Logan Cooley. Logan Cooley needs time, okay? And he needs time not because he tries too many inventive, dynamic plays. It's because he's not very good defensively. I know that for some of you probably read reports that counter that claim. Believe me when I say he's not very good defensively. He was in a system that's basically the equivalent of the Harlem Globetrotters. Okay, I can't stand the program. I have no problem saying it publicly. It's not because I have no problem with Nightingale. I've talked to their coach on before. I get it. It's useful for marketing for the USHL. It is a horrible situation for a scout to be in, trying to pick apart the program year in and year out when you have players who are put in positions they wouldn't be if they were on other teams in USHL, because then they'd be able to play higher up in the lineup. So it creates a lot of problems in terms of trying to actually assess where some of these kids are at for this class. So for instance, one of the biggest issues was that there was games where they'd blow a team out, it'd be 5-0. So of course Logan Cooley is going to be flying down the ice, back onto the net, trying the most ridiculous looking passing play you've ever seen, right? And so it's what we had to do then is weight his international resume, which is admittedly small because the U20s was reduced. So you take his U20s, it's reduced U20s, you take his U18s. Well, then you get a better indicator of what this player is actually going to be like when he's out of the Harlem Globetrotter system. And what we saw was structure. He quieted his game down. That's an incredibly important component to this. If he didn't quiet his game down at those events, I don't know publicly how he'd look, but I guarantee you on our list and privately, he would be moving back, right? Structure is critical in terms of being able to evaluate their translation to the NHL. The other factor with Logan Cooley is that he is not a gifted thinker of the game relative to other high-end players that are coming out of the program from the center position in recent years. For instance, you guys have one of them, Jack Hughes. Jack Hughes is a vastly, in my opinion, vastly superior talent to Logan Cooley. To give you an idea of the lack of depth here in the top 5 to 7 picks. The other is Trevor Zegras. If you look at Trevor Zegras, it's not close between the two for me. I think Trevor Zegras is the smarter, more dynamic player and a much better shooter, which we'll get to in a second. The other component with Cooley is that when we're talking about hockey sense, I know you're going to see this nonsense phrase that's being used constantly online and publicly now called problem-solving ability. Okay, this was a phrase that was created by Darryl Belfry in his skills coaches books to explain a certain criteria of hockey sense and what you're looking for in specific components of the ice surface. Some people have decided to generalize that and decided that hockey sense is based off of problem solving exclusively, which is absurd. The problem solving is useful as a component of hockey sense when you're specifically discussing small area ice plays. Where they have to think themselves out of a bad spot, right? That's when, because then you're problem solving. You're trying to get out of a bad spot dynamically. We try to do a much better job in our book of systematically breaking down hockey sense into different components. What we're doing now with processing ability, which is one of the primary components of hockey sense, is breaking that down into 2 categories. The first is dynamic processing, meaning moment-to-moment evaluations on the ice. Okay, so when Jack Hughes is flying at full speed and he's trying to puck handle through 2 separate players, it's his ability to dynamically interact to the position of the defenseman relative to the positioning of himself, plus the stick to the puck, and his ability to assess what his best option is in terms of getting around them, right? So that what you're looking at is you're looking at different components of hockey sense blending together with dynamic processing, like spatial awareness, like anticipating the play, creativity, deception. All these components of hockey sense are merging together through the dynamic processing. However, there's a secondary processing component, which we call pre-planned processing, which means it's your visual mapping of the ice. It's the prospect's ability to recognize in advance weak side options or backdoor options. It's their tempo control, their ability to feel the rhythm of play on the ice. Logan Cooley does not have good pre-planned processing. He has exceptional, dynamic, adaptive moment-to-moment evaluations. He does not have the pre-planned processing that you see in Jack Hughes or Trevor Zegras. He's much more similar to Tim Stützle than Zegras or Jack Hughes. However, we had Tim Stützle in a deadlock tie for 1 overall in the superior top 10 in 2020. The reason we like Tim Stützle more than Logan Cooley is because of the toolkit. Logan Cooley is an exceptional skater. Tim Stützle is an elite skater. Logan Cooley is an exceptional puck handler. Tim Stützle is an elite puck handler. Logan Cooley is an below average shooter. Tim Stützle is an above average mechanical shooter. So there are tool elements plus a skill element that allows Stützle to reign over Logan Cooley. But my point in saying this is that when you're looking at the center position, he's going to be extremely reliant on making and creating plays for himself without incorporating his teammates as often. He's not, Shane Wright is a calculated tic-tac-toe or give and go or cycle generating playmaker. Logan Cooley does not function like that. It's very much what he feels on the ice in a moment to moment and calibrating that. And so he relies very much on his skill set. So the very different interpretations in terms of the center position between Wright, Cooley, and these aforementioned centers that we're talking about now in terms of, I know that Stützle was a winger that's been transitioned, I think, against his will to center at Ottawa, but Jack Hughes, for instance, and even let's bring in Nico Hischier, who's much better at pre-planned processing the play as well relative to Cooley. So that's why I'm basically saying is I wouldn't take the center that's smaller, that needs to be more reliant on just his adaptive processing ability, and not a great defensive player who needs more time relative to a player like Juraj Slafkovsky, who's almost NHL ready based off his World Championship performance. I think a lot of people would actually say he is NHL ready. I wouldn't rush him personally because of his TPS performances, but I could see the argument. But Cooley, you're talking about, I think he needs 2 years, right? So that alone might mean that for the Devils, it's not very palatable because, as you said, they were expected to do well this year and it didn't happen.
Yeah. And what you're saying about Cooley makes me think about two things. One, that's a player that could really benefit from the college game where he's headed next year, and by your suggestion, perhaps the year after that, where that sort of systematic thinking is, beaten into you as a player. And two, the idea of a play driver. I think the idea that Cooley is not a play driver, perhaps in the sense that most people use the word, where he might be overly reliant on his individual skill as opposed to taking advantage of kind of systematic thinking. I think that'll be a surprise to some people because I think, and maybe it's a winger versus center thing, most people would see Slafkovsky as the one that needs to be taped to a Jack Hughes or a Nico Hischier versus Logan Cooley, who might be seen publicly as more of a play driver, but it almost sounds like the opposite.
That's exactly right. That's one of the issues with Slafkovsky that seems to be at least publicly portrayed, is that he's not a very intelligent player. Slafkovsky's best attributes are his playmaking ability and his understanding of how to take advantage of his leverages within his frame to come off the walls, draw in opposing defensemen, and that in turn readjusts his lanes and allows the ice surface to open up. Right? There's playmakers can do it. There's different ways to get it done. Right? For instance, like Shane Wright's a brilliant playmaker, but he doesn't draw in defense in order to make his passing plays. He's just that precise. He's that technically gifted. Whereas Slafkovsky, you're looking at somebody who's like, hang on, I'm 6'4", 220, and I know it. I'm gonna dictate here. I'm gonna force you to be drawn in, be magnetized to me, and that in turn opens up and readjusts lanes dynamically for him. And then when you take into consideration his creativity, well, it really opens up the ice because it makes him incredibly unpredictable. That's one thing I would say they both have, though. Is Cooley and Slafkovsky are both unpredictable players. It's just Slafkovsky has a toolkit that Cooley simply doesn't have, which gives him more value in terms of how unpredictable he can really be in certain scenarios. Right. The other aspect that I think some people might be misinterpreting with Slafkovsky is you're going to, okay, there is a decent chance that both Wright and Cooley end up better point producers than Slafkovsky. My point is it really might not matter because areas that are underrepresented is still extremely critical when it comes to the most important games at the NHL level, which are in the playoffs. So I'm sure some of you listening have watched Mikko Rantanen play in the playoffs here for Colorado. One of the gifts that Mikko Rantanen has is something that Slafkovsky also possesses at even maybe a better rate theoretically down the line than even Rantanen, which is that his ability to create weighted minutes for opposing defenses and goalies, meaning if he can drive possession below the goal line for significant time, that drains the opposing defenses and goalies at the highest rate out of any area on the ice. It's far more draining for goalies to have to constantly enter and come out of their reverse VH position or integrate in and out of their posts and constantly turn and rotate and remain in semi-crouch positions, right? I remember this was a while ago, but Jonathan Quick was talking about the most frustrating player to play against the NHL was Ryan Getzlaf. And the reason why is because he constantly had to contort his body and adjust to what Getzlaf was attempting to do down low. These are the types of little subtleties that are not really publicly discussed that NHL staffs do covet, because what deconditioning a team does in a playoff series is obviously it slows them down and it makes defensemen more error prone. If you want to make somebody who's brilliant at the game make a mistake, make them tired. That's something that Juraj Slafkovsky does that he should be able to do at an utterly elite level relative to a Shane Wright.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's the sort of thing that, like you said, the public doesn't necessarily engage in that type of talk, but also doesn't necessarily have access to that level of analysis, which is why I think things tend to skew towards point production, which I think historically paints players like Slafkovsky in their draft year in a poorer light. And so, like, the Devils, for example, have invested some serious draft capital in players like, let's say, Pavel Zacha, for example, a player who seems by point standards to have underperformed relative to his draft status. And so when you have this fan base set in this position where it seems like they're going to be deciding between a player like Slafkovsky and someone like Logan Cooley, there is almost like trauma there of like, oh no, this is happening again. But it sounds like privately and, with your level of expertise, there are other considerations that don't get weighted very favorably in the public that would favor a player like Slafkovsky.
Yeah, it's really important to look at some analytic metrics in terms of the pro game. I always make fun of data sets for junior draft eligibles. I think 7-game data sets give you almost next to nothing. If you're tracking data, it's not going to really help you actually give a good presentation of what the player really is, because you have to project them in terms of their physical growth rates and then look at their usage, look at the teams they're playing against. There's so many factors that go into that, right? But in terms of when you're looking at the pro game, the NHL level, that's where analytics can really have a firm establishment on the value of certain metrics. And one of the values is generating pressure on defense when it comes to exits. Okay. And when it comes to the player who's exiting the blue line first in possession, trying to get through the neutral zone, applying pressure correctly is one of the most important factors in the game in terms of turnover rates. Slafkovsky projects to be the best of the three at that metric. That doesn't mean he's going to produce more, right? But it's another area when you're talking about, okay, he's going to be the one that has the best possession driving metrics. He's going to be the down low. He's going to be the one that can generate pressure off the forecheck and on the first guy who's trying to get up the ice through the neutral zone. He's going to be the best defensively of the three, I think, long term. So you look at those three factors, and then you look at the neutral zone entry rates. I think Cooley projects to be the best of the three long term, but Slafkovsky's no slouch, and Shane Wright should be fine too. But they're all three are good, but Slafkovsky's gonna be right there. These are, if you get a 60-point player who you shut down an opposing team's top line. If you get a Valeri Nichushkin style player defensively, but then you get one of the most creative, dynamic power forwards in the process offensively who can generate weighted minutes at a better rate maybe theoretically than Mikko Rantanen. I mean, you're talking about a heck of a player, right? Just a heck of a player. And one thing that's really interesting about Juraj Slafkovsky is you're not going to have to wait as long. I'll give you Devils listeners an example. Blake Coleman is an example of a player who's extremely useful when he wasn't scoring, right? Blake Coleman is a heck of a player, but he didn't need to always score to be that player. And it was all about his skating, his pressure generating, his ability to defend, his penalty killing, right? His willingness to play bigger than his size and drive opposing teams crazy, because he's never stopped moving. His pace was always high, right? So these are factors that Slafkovsky has within his game that really give him value. But unlike Blake Coleman, it took him time to develop. This is where Slafkovsky has a much more exciting trajectory, his development curve, right? When it comes to prospects, one of the things that really is a separating factor for scouts, including us, including myself, is the development curve of a player. So if you look at Shane Wright's curve, it completely stagnated. In fact, you can make an argument it went backwards in some ways. Juraj Slafkovsky, you look at him from the take away his Olympia performance. His initial viewings in TPS, if you took a 7-game sample of his initial viewings in TPS and you look at his last 7 games of the World Championships, the curve is exactly what you're looking for. Again, you look at Shane Wright's curve from his best performances 2 years ago, and you look at his seven game set in the playoffs this year, you're worried. You're worried.
Right.
You have a justified right to be worried. There's a reason he had, I believe, it was 39 goals in his rookie season, and he went down to 32 this season. Right? That's not what you want ever in a first overall player. And I get it. I know some of you, the argument would be, well, hang on, he's passing the puck more often. You're right, he was. And yes, I want to see a player who's a natural dual threat and take advantage of his teammates, especially with the way that he needs to operate. You're right, to a degree. But there's a counterpoint, which is that, again, you want a player to dictate. To me, it seemed like he was trying to defer to his teammates. Why would a player want to defer to his teammates more often? Because it gives them an excuse if things go badly. And that's a result of being pressured as a result of having to be the projected first overall pick entering the draft season. Right. And that's where there's this give and take and this nuance and the chaos of trying to get this ranking correctly. Right. It is incredibly difficult. That said, I'll say this. I think it's super tight. I really don't think the Slafkovsky or Wright or Cooley, I don't think it's going to be outlandish in terms of like one of them is going to bust outright or one of them is going to be 20 30 points over the other. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be like that. I think they're going to be relatively close to each other. They're just going to play very differently. But I'll be honest, I really think you Devils fans and should be very excited about the idea of getting Slafkovsky. Very unique player, extremely unique player. He fits perfectly with what you're building. You have the centers that can help him out too. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential there for Slafkovsky.
That's wonderful. Yeah, no, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and give your expert opinion, just because, like we've been saying, the public discourse is so different from the private one, I think. And the way I think Devils fans specifically have been conditioned just based on the highs and mostly the lows of the past several seasons.
It's been tough. You guys have good prospects though.
Yeah. It's just it's a fan base that has been hearing that it's coming for a while, and so there's a lot of pressure from the fans, and I think just a lot of anxiety, not to screw this up. And so I really appreciate your insight into Slafkovsky, who I think has been viewed as the riskier option, the more kind of higher floor, lower ceiling kind of option, which based on what we've been discussing today might not actually be the case. So I really appreciate you lending your expertise.
No problem. Thanks for having me, Duncan. If any of your listeners out there are interested in getting to read more of our work, head over to hockeyprospect.com. Our black book is available. It is the industry gold standard. We have hundreds of NHL scout quotes in our books. We have live viewings of every player all over the world in rinks. We have a real established team, and I just want to give a shout out to the staff I'm a part of. None of it would be possible without them. And this is the last year our black book is going to be this in depth. We are modifying our book. So if you're newcomers to our product, this will be the one to jump on. And again, it's more in depth than basically any other guide you'll see out there. And we try to blend the psychology with the technical aspects, and then give a much more broader, generalized industry stance on players. You get a much more wide-ranging opinions than you'll see publicly, because I always say this: there is no such thing as an actual consensus, despite you seeing it online.
Mm-hmm. I love it. Yeah, thank you so much, Brad. And I'll be sure to link to the Black Book and Hockey Prospect in general. Thanks for giving us your time.